Hello, my dear friends. This is Dr.Deepins speaking. Right now, as you're watching this video, somewhere in your home, there's a bar of chocolate or a pack of cookies, and you're looking at it with a sense of guilt, like it's forbidden fruit, something you're not allowed to have. If you're living with diabetes or prediabetes, and every time you walk past the sweets aisle you feel a mix of longing and fear, this conversation can change your life. Because in the next few minutes, I'm going to dismantle one of the harshest and most persistent myths in modern diabetology. The myth that if you have diabetes, you are doomed to live the rest of your life without a single sweet bite. Right now, inside your body, something may be happening that no fasting blood test can reveal. And that process is directly connected to what you ate last night instead of dessert, when you were trying to be disciplined. I'm going to tell you about 5 sweets that are not just allowed with diabetes. They are, in certain conditions, beneficial and even necessary. One of these products is sold in every store, costs very little, and when used correctly, can reduce post-meal blood sugar more effectively than many restrictive diets. We'll also talk about why your endocrinologist never tells you this during appointments. Not because they're hiding something, but because they have 7 minutes per patient, and in 7 minutes it's impossible to explain the biochemistry of pleasure. Stay with me until the end, because the final section will give you a personal 30-day protocol that I've pieced together from the latest research. But before we begin, write in the comments how many years you've been living with diabetes and where you're watching from. It really matters to me to understand how far this message travels. Now, imagine a retired accountant, a 67-year-old woman with neat handwriting and a lifelong habit of doing everything by the book. She followed routines her entire life. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 7. No deviations. When she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, she treated it like a work assignment. She received a list of forbidden foods and eliminated all sweets from her life overnight, without regret. She was even proud of it. She kept a detailed glucose journal, measured every portion of buckwheat, and fell asleep listening to nutrition podcasts. But 8 months later, during a routine checkup, her endocrinologist looked at her lab results and raised an eyebrow. Her HbA1c hadn't gone down, it had gone up. She couldn't understand how that was possible. She had done everything right, everything according to the rules. What happened next, and why her strict refusal of sweets backfired? I'll explain shortly. But first, we need to understand something she didn't know. Her pancreas wasn't failing. It was suffering from something else. Something that happened to her hormones every time she denied herself even a small moment of pleasure. And you won't find that written on any sugar substitute packaging. Have you ever noticed that after eating diabetic cookies from a pharmacy, your blood sugar spikes higher than after a small piece of real chocolate? That's not random. And it's not because your body is broken. It's a system. And now I'm going to give you 7 signs that your approach to sweets is actually working against you, even if you believe you're doing everything correctly. Sign 1. Uncontrollable cravings at night. You've followed your diet all day, but by 10 p.m., you're standing in front of the fridge, unable to stop yourself. This is not a lack of willpower. Your brain, deprived of glucose and serotonin, switches into emergency mode and demands carbohydrates at any cost. Strict restriction without understanding the mechanism leads to nighttime binges that spike your blood sugar far more than a small portion of the right chocolate at 3 p.m. ever would. Sign 2. Sudden fatigue. 1 to 2 hours after eating, you ate a perfect meal, no sugar, everything clean, and suddenly you feel exhausted. This is reactive hypoglycemia. Your pancreas released too much insulin in response to a glycemic spike, and now your sugar has dropped below normal. Ironically, meals with high glycemic impact, even if sugar-free, can cause this roller coaster, while properly composed chocolate may not. Sign 3. Anxiety and irritability. If you find yourself snapping at loved ones or feeling constant tension, it may not be your personality. It may be a lack of tryptophan, a precursor to serotonin, disrupted when certain carbohydrates are completely removed from your diet. Your brain is signaling, I don't have the raw materials to produce happiness. Sign 4. Creeping depression and loss of joy. Diabetes is already a heavy burden. Add total deprivation, and life can begin to feel empty. This emotional state raises cortisol, a key driver of insulin resistance. Sign 5. Poor sleep and high morning sugar. You haven't eaten since evening, yet your glucose is elevated in the morning. This is the dawn phenomenon. Hormones like cortisol and growth hormone trigger glucose release from the liver, especially if your dinner lacked balance. Proper sweets at the right time can actually help stabilize this. Sign 6. Constant guilt around food. Every meal becomes an internal battle. Chronic stress equals elevated cortisol. Elevated cortisol equals insulin resistance. A vicious cycle that cannot be broken by restriction alone, only by understanding. Sign 7. No improvement in lab results. Exactly what happened to our accountant. She followed every rule and got worse results. Up to 40% of type 2 diabetics who strictly eliminate sweets fail to reach target HbA1c levels after a year, because diet without biochemical understanding is like taking medication without knowing what it does. But here is what almost no one talks about openly. The emotional side of diabetes management is not secondary. It is central. The mind and the body are not separate systems running on parallel tracks. They are a single, deeply integrated network. When your emotional needs go unmet, your physiology registers the damage, quietly, invisibly, but persistently. Think about what it means to live inside a body that you have learned to fear. Every meal becomes a calculation. Every celebration, a birthday cake, a holiday table, a cup of tea with a neighbor, becomes a battlefield where you fight yourself. Over time, this vigilance doesn't protect you, it exhausts you, and exhaustion has a blood sugar number attached to it. Research from the American Diabetes Association, published in the last decade, has increasingly pointed towards something that practitioners have intuitively known for a long time. Patient outcomes improve dramatically when emotional well-being is treated as part of the clinical picture. Not a bonus, not a soft add-on, a core component. The woman I described earlier, our accountant, is not an exception. She is the rule. Across diabetes support groups, online forums, and clinical waiting rooms, her story repeats itself thousands of times a day. People doing everything right on paper and deteriorating anyway. Because the paper doesn't measure cortisol, it doesn't measure grief, it doesn't measure the sound of an empty chair at the Sunday table. I want you to understand something before we move into the science. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are a human being living inside a system that gave you rules without context. And context, biochemical, emotional, practical, is everything. Now, let's talk about something unexpected. Imagine holding not a chocolate bar, but a concentrated capsule of flavonoids, magnesium, polyphenols, and bioactive compounds studied by leading research centers. That's what dark chocolate, 70% cocoa or higher, really is. But to understand why it can be beneficial, we need to go deeper. When you eat sugar, your pancreas releases insulin, a key that opens your cells to let glucose in. In type 2 diabetes, the lock is rusty. The key is there, but the door doesn't open. That's insulin resistance. Fast carbohydrates hit like a hammer, causing spikes, insulin surges, and further damage. But flavonoids in dark chocolate do the opposite. They improve insulin sensitivity, like oiling the rusty lock. However, there's a crucial detail: timing, quantity, and combination. Chocolate on an empty stomach at 6 p.m. is not the same as chocolate after a balanced meal. These are completely different metabolic events. And this principle applies to all 5 sweets. Let's go through them. First, dark chocolate at 70% cocoa or higher, 15 to 20 grams after a protein-rich meal, never on an empty stomach. The reason timing matters so deeply here is that protein slows gastric emptying, the rate at which food leaves your stomach and enters the small intestine. When you slow that process, you blunt the glycemic response to anything that follows. The flavonoids in the chocolate then have the opportunity to do their work in a calmer metabolic environment. Second, berries. Blueberries, blackberries, and currants in particular. These are rich in anthocyanins, the pigments that give them their deep color. Anthocyanins have been shown in multiple studies to slow glucose absorption in the gut by inhibiting certain digestive enzymes. About 100 grams as a snack, ideally mid-morning or early afternoon, provides fiber, micronutrients, and a slow release of natural sugars that your body handles very differently from the sugars in processed foods. Third, natural yogurt with cinnamon and nuts. This combination is more powerful than it might appear. Natural yogurt, unsweetened, full fat if possible, provides probiotics that support gut health, which is increasingly understood to be a major factor in metabolic regulation. The gut microbiome influences insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and even mood. Cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, a compound that has been studied for its ability to improve glucose uptake by cells. And nuts provide healthy fats and protein that anchor the meal and prevent a glucose spike. Together, these three ingredients create a synergistic effect greater than any one of them alone. Fourth, baked apple with walnuts, a warm dessert that satisfies deeply, particularly in cooler months when the body craves comfort. Baking the apple softens the pectin in its skin, making the fiber more available for fermentation by gut bacteria. Walnuts add omega-3 fatty acids and a protein buffer. The result is a dessert that provides genuine sweetness and warmth without the metabolic disruption of processed sugar. For many people, this becomes a replacement for the kinds of comfort foods they thought they had to give up forever. Fifth, dried apricots or prunes, 5 to 6 pieces. In small amounts, and this qualifier matters enormously, dried fruits provide a dense source of potassium, magnesium, and fiber. Potassium is critical for cardiovascular health, which is particularly important for people with diabetes who have elevated cardiovascular risk. The slow-release energy from a small number of dried fruits, eaten with a handful of nuts, provides a bridge between meals that prevents the glucose dips that lead to overeating later. Now, what ties all 5 of these together? It's not just their nutritional profile. It's the fact that they satisfy something real. They answer a genuine biological and emotional need. They do not ask you to white-knuckle your way through desire. They say yes, under these conditions, in these quantities at this time. And that yes matters far more than most people realize. Let's talk about the biochemistry of restriction for a moment, because this is where so many people get lost. When you restrict something intensely, your brain does not simply accept the new order and move on. It files the restriction as a threat. Specifically, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, begins to lose ground to the limbic system, which is responsible for survival drives. The limbic system does not care about your HbA1c. It cares about pleasure, safety, and the avoidance of pain. When you deny it consistently, it waits. And when you are tired, stressed, or emotionally depleted, which is to say, on a completely ordinary evening, it wins. This is why the nighttime binge is not a character flaw. It is a predictable outcome of a strategy that ignores how the brain actually works. Understanding this is not an excuse to abandon all dietary discipline. It is an invitation to build a smarter strategy, one that works with your neurobiology rather than against it. There is also a hormonal dimension that is rarely discussed in 7-minute appointments. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with feelings of calm, satisfaction, and well-being, is synthesized from tryptophan, an amino acid whose transport across the blood-brain barrier is partly facilitated by carbohydrates. When you eliminate carbohydrates too aggressively, you can inadvertently reduce the brain's ability to make serotonin. Low serotonin does not just make you feel sad. It increases carbohydrate cravings, disrupts sleep, amplifies anxiety, and, here is the connection that almost no one makes, it elevates cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. In the short term, it is useful. In the long term, chronically elevated cortisol does the following. It increases blood glucose through gluconeogenesis, the liver's production of new glucose. It promotes fat storage around the abdomen. It impairs immune function. It disrupts sleep architecture, and it drives insulin resistance. The very thing you were trying to fight by eliminating sweets, you may have been making worse through the hormonal cascade triggered by chronic restriction and stress. This is not a reason to eat whatever you want. It is a reason to understand that emotional and psychological factors are not peripheral to diabetes management. They are central. Your feelings about food are not a weakness to be overcome. They are data to be understood and incorporated into your plan. There is a concept in clinical psychology called the abstinence violation effect. It describes what happens when someone who is committed to strict abstinence from alcohol, from certain foods, from any behavior, inevitably slips. Instead of viewing the slip as a small, correctable event, they experience it as proof of their fundamental failure. And paradoxically, this interpretation leads to greater consumption, not less. The slip becomes a spiral. This pattern is extraordinarily common among people with diabetes who have adopted rigid dietary rules. One cookie becomes a catastrophe. One dinner out with friends becomes a week of guilt and compensatory over-restriction. The cycle perpetuates itself, not because the person lacks willpower, but because the strategy they were given does not account for human psychology. The protocol I'm about to share with you in the final section is designed specifically to interrupt this cycle. It does not ask you to be perfect. It asks you to be intentional. Now, let's return to our accountant. At her next appointment, a thoughtful doctor asked her something no one had asked before. Tell me about your life this past year. Not her labs, her life. Her husband had passed away. Every Sunday, they used to drink tea with chocolates together. After his death, she banned sweets because they reminded her of him. But each day without that ritual was a silent emotional burden. Her cortisol stayed elevated, and cortisol raises blood sugar, regardless of diet. So her recovery didn't begin with a new diet. It began with restoring one small ritual, Sunday tea, one piece of dark chocolate, in memory of her husband, and as an act of self-respect. 3 months later, her HbA1c dropped for the first time in 2 years. I want you to sit with that story for a moment before we move into the protocol, because what happened to her is not unusual. It is not a miracle. It is what happens when emotional reality is finally allowed to be part of the medical picture. The body keeps the score. This is the title of a landmark book by trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk. And while his focus is on psychological trauma, the principle extends fully into the day-to-day experience of living with chronic illness. Grief, loneliness, the loss of rituals that gave life meaning. These experiences accumulate in the body. They show up in lab results. They show up in HbA1c numbers that refuse to budge no matter how perfectly you follow the rules. Restoring the Sunday ritual did not just help our accountant emotionally. It signaled to her nervous system that safety had returned, that pleasure was permitted, that life, despite everything, still contained sweetness, and her body responded accordingly. Now, here is your 30-day protocol. This is not a rigid prescription. It is a framework, a set of gentle, progressive steps designed to restore balance across the biochemical, psychological, and relational dimensions of your life with diabetes. Week 1. 2 squares of dark chocolate daily after lunch. Choose chocolate that is 70% cocoa or higher. Read the label. It should contain cocoa mass, cocoa butter, and minimal added sugar. Eat it slowly after a balanced meal that includes protein and fiber. Pay attention to how you feel, not with anxiety, but with genuine curiosity. Notice whether the anticipated guilt arrives, and if it does, simply observe it. You are not doing something forbidden. You are doing something deliberate. During this first week, keep a simple log, not of calories or carbohydrates, but of your mood, your sleep quality, and your evening cravings. These 3 variables will tell you something important about how your body and brain are responding to the reintroduction of intentional pleasure. Week 2. Add a berry snack. 100 grams of blueberries, blackberries, or currants, eaten as a mid-morning or early afternoon snack. If fresh berries are not available, frozen are equally effective. The anthocyanins are preserved through freezing. Pair the berries with a small handful of almonds or walnuts to further blunt any glycemic response. Again, observe. Measure your blood sugar 2 hours after if you are monitoring closely. You may be surprised by what you find. During week 2, also begin to notice the difference between eating with guilt and eating with awareness. These are not merely emotional states. They produce different physiological outcomes. Eating with guilt activates the stress response. Eating with awareness activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which supports digestion, blood sugar regulation, and recovery. The exact same food, eaten in 2 different emotional contexts, produces meaningfully different metabolic results. This is not metaphor, this is biology. Week 3, evening yogurt with cinnamon and nuts. 150 grams of natural unsweetened yogurt, Greek style if available, topped with a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon and a small handful of mixed nuts. Eaten in the evening, approximately 2 hours before sleep. This combination supports the gut microbiome overnight, provides a slow trickle of protein that can reduce the dawn phenomenon, and offers a ritual of warmth and nourishment, that replaces the empty hunger so many people feel in the evening hours. The cinnamon does not need to be measured precisely. Generosity here is fine. This is also the week to begin examining your relationship with evening eating more broadly. For many people with diabetes, the evening is the most difficult time. It is when the day's discipline crumbles, when the pantry calls, when the exhaustion of having been vigilant for 12 or 14 hours finally becomes overwhelming. The yogurt ritual is designed to provide something real and satisfying at this vulnerable hour, so that the choice you make is an intentional one rather than a desperate one. Week 4. Create one weekly sweet ritual. This is the most personal part of the protocol, and perhaps the most important. Choose one moment each week, just one, that you will dedicate to a conscious, joyful, sweet experience. It might be Sunday afternoon tea with a piece of dark chocolate, as our accountant rediscovered. It might be a baked apple shared with a grandchild on a Saturday evening. It might be a small bowl of berries with a spoonful of natural yogurt, eaten slowly while reading something you love. The specific food matters less than the specific intention. The ritual must be chosen in advance, prepared with care, and experienced without guilt. If guilt arrives anyway, and it may, especially in the beginning, do not fight it. Simply acknowledge it and continue eating. Guilt is a habit. Like all habits, it weakens when it is no longer rewarded with avoidance. Beyond the 4 weeks, here are several principles to carry forward. Context is everything. The glycemic response to any food is not fixed. It varies depending on what else you ate, when you ate it, how much you slept the night before, how stressed you are, and whether you exercised recently. This is not a license to eat carelessly. It is a reminder that rigid rules applied without context will always fail you at the edges. Pleasure is not the enemy of health. This may be the single most important thing I can say to you. The body does not experience genuine pleasure as a threat. It experiences it as a signal that life is good, that needs are being met, that safety exists. This signal has downstream effects on every system in your body, including the metabolic systems that regulate blood sugar. You cannot hate yourself well. You cannot restrict yourself into joy. You can only move toward health by moving toward a life that is worth the effort of maintaining. Small rituals are anchors. The human nervous system stabilizes through repetition and meaning. A cup of tea at the same time each day, a walk after dinner, a piece of chocolate on Sunday. These small rituals are not indulgences. They are infrastructure. They tell your nervous system, this is a safe, predictable world. And a nervous system that feels safe regulates blood sugar better than one living in chronic alert. Community matters more than any diet. The loneliness and isolation that so often accompany chronic illness are among its most damaging components. Eating alone, without pleasure, without conversation, without the human warmth of a shared table. This takes a physiological toll that no amount of perfect food choices can fully offset. If there is one thing you can change this month that is not on any conventional diabetes management list, it is this. Eat with other people whenever you can, not to monitor what they eat or what you eat, simply to be in the company of others while nourishing yourself. Your emotional relationship with food is part of your treatment. I want to say this one more time because it bears repeating. Eating with guilt triggers stress. Eating with awareness creates a different hormonal response. The meal you eat in peace is metabolically different from the meal you eat in shame. This is not weakness. This is physiology, and you can use it in your favor. And now I want you to promise yourself something. You will no longer eat with guilt. Because every conscious choice is not a diet. It's self-care. And every small, intentional pleasure is also self-care. Diabetes does not take away your right to enjoy life. It changes the rules, but it does not cancel joy. Living well and managing your blood sugar is not a privilege. It's a skill. And like any skill, it comes with understanding. If this conversation gave you even one new insight about the biochemistry of your cravings, about the cortisol connection, about the woman who healed herself by restoring a Sunday ritual, then this time was not wasted. You are not your diagnosis. You are a person who deserves accurate information, genuine compassion, and a life that still contains sweetness in every sense of the word. This was Dr. Deepins. Take care of yourself.